We did mail it out earlier. So Mike Purdy is with us tonight. I first met Mike in the year 1999 at the Jean Gebser Society conference at Mike's institution at the time, which was Governor State University, which is south of Chicago, a very interesting institution of learning. And Mike was at that time head of the communications department, and you had that position for many years. But Mike has been a participant in the Gebser conferences and for all that period, and is now joined us by Zoom frequently for our sessions. And it's wonderful to have you here, Mike, to present on listening, which is an area of your scholarly as well as personal interest. So take it away.
Okay, we're going to start here.
Yeah.
I might be looking to the left every now and then because I've got my notes over there, but mainly we'll be following the PowerPoint. So we could start there.
Okay, I will share
it. Oh, you're at the end.
Yeah, I'll get this. There we go.
Good. Yeah, there we go. Listening dialogue is what we're talking about, but we could also call it improvisational listening or listening consciously, which is the title of an article I wrote for the International Journal of the Listening Association. And there I mapped out Gebser's structures of consciousness, the 4 or 5 levels, ending with conscious listening, the integral consciousness. And that's where this really we will get to in the end. It's like as a background, as a field, we will be talking about the shifts in consciousness in the field of listening. So we could begin here. I think we start with Kitaro, Zen master. Yep, nothing is beyond God is the book, and Kitaro's words. Any true communication with another person takes place in this dimension of no thought and no conception. So this is what we'll be dealing with here is the field of a listening situation. And you saw riding the horse backwards. We'll get to that, but it's about being open and being present in the listening situation. And so we listen in such a way to achieve true communication. Now that's should be in quotes, but basically an openness to shift listening styles. And that's what I'll get to in the end. First, I want to do some historical looks at listening and the consciousness of listening before the modern era. And so we need to look at listening with an openness to shifting listening styles so that we're listening in a way that we adapt to the situation and what is emerging. So we could call it emergent listening as well. Oh, next one. So a short allusion to a history of listening and civilization. And I mentioned this in a paper recently, a short article for the Global Listening Center in Calcutta, India. And I said there that listening is the pinnacle of civilization. If we can listen effectively, if we could get enough people listening effectively, we could have a tremendous impact and be in a truly, as Gebser would say, integral consciousness. And that would be a conscious listening. So looking at the history of listening with the beginning of attention to listening from the late 19th century, and especially Freud and Jung and others like Lou Salome, we get a sense that there's a shift in that late 19th century. And I think it begins around the time of Nietzsche, and I've been studying Nietzsche and reading a lot. And I found recently a quote by him we'll mention later. But I think this is most interesting to the Jung Society, is that around that time, into the time of Freud and then Jung, we really have a different approach to listening, a different sense of what listening is about. Before that, it's not so individual and subjective, and it's not individuation, as Jung would say. So too, listening and some old and new approaches, we'll look at that: who, what, why, how, some schemes for better listening, and some steps or processes. And finally, we'll get to dialogic listening to define and elaborate the three movements of conscious listening, at least as I've developed them over the years here. So next slide. So first we begin with the Old Testament. Listen, O Israel. But also you find this in the Indian society, which is more mythic. And still in the 15th century, you find the Sikh Guru Nanak saying, listen to the Guru. It's there is a little of this in the Greeks too, but mainly it's from mythic cultures, and it's a command to listen. And we don't find that when we shift to modern views of listening. We can begin with Socrates and midwifery, and here I use this in my teaching. I taught in the university for 40 some years, and it was really a Socratic dialogue. And in the Socratic dialogue, the focus is not on the listening. The focus is on the revealing of wisdom. And so at the most, Socrates must be having a strong sense of listening to know what questions to ask and how to bring forth the wisdom that he would like in the Socratic dialogue. And I called this midwifery, because you help birth ideas. And also there's the Bhagavad Gita, to go back to the East. And there are two lessons there in the Gita about listening. Listen rather than talk. And again, it could be a semi-command. And God resides in the heart of all beings. So listen again, right? But there's maybe a beginning of a shift there too. So next slide. A quote that is common in recent times is from Nietzsche: one should try to be a true listener. And this was, I just found like a week or so ago. And it really, this is a lot of people in listening who are experts and write about it and teach it, use this quote. And I found it came from 1877, 1878 in Nietzsche's work, The Wanderer and His Shadow. But it's very interesting that this, I think, is a pivotal place where we shift to a modern, subjective, really conscious listening that we didn't have before. So one should try to be a true listener, that is, focus on listening to what is said rather than constructing one's own reply. And any modern listening textbook you pick up would start with that kind of a statement. So I also wrote a short paper. John had read it, and he had a comment. But Freud, and then more clearly and transparently Jung, were the first to openly express the importance of listening. There was a shift to listening per se in itself, right, and the study of it. But in my article, so let's go here first. For Freud, the therapist should simply listen and not bother about whether he's keeping anything in mind. So it's a strong, focused listening process that Freud is developing. But as John told me, Jung learned some things from Freud, and one was how to be a better listener. It's not just about focusing. For Jung, the therapist's role is that of a supportive listener and a self-aware person, a conscious listener, who would not be projecting anything because they would be aware of what is happening in a situation. And this is what we would call a Jungian integrality. There's no unconscious projecting, only supportive listening. And the more I read, I've been reading von Franz that John mentioned, and I read Hillman, and I've read Jung in 3 different periods since my graduate school times. And more and more, I see how Jung really was one of the primary sources for Gebser and Gebser's studies of the structure of consciousness. You find it implicitly in Jung's work, and we find it implicitly in von Franz. And I'm reading her now, so I'm noticing that. So next one. Oh, so the error of listening as subjective. Here we move into the modern world. And for more than 80 years of listening, study, and research, we've been focused in this way on listening. You could point to some early studies. There was one in 1927 about the amount of time we spend listening as opposed to speaking, and it's like 2 to 1. And so there was a beginning of an awareness of the importance of listening. And then Nanny Style, Ralph Nichols, 54 and 57. I think some of Ralph Nichols, who was often called the father of listening in the Listening Association. I've met him many times, and of course he's passed now, but a wonderful individual and very sensitive, very empathic, and he passed on an important legacy about listening. And I think his work began right around 1949, but the first book we have is 54, and then again 57. And then we also have Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, to name a few of the modern authors that you'd also be familiar with. And so the International Listening Association was started by Manny Stiles, Ralph Nichols, and others, and that was 1979. And it's interesting, I joined in 81, and that's about the same time I joined the Gebser Society for the Study of Consciousness. Both were coming together at the same time. One quote from Carl Rogers: "Man's inability to communicate is a result of his failure to listen effectively." And so again, we have that primacy of the listening process, of the act of listening as so very important. So I'm going to present here a few examples of what people have put together in the modern period from the 50s through present time. The first one, Are You Listening? Nichols and Stevens, published in the Journal of Communications in 58, listed these 6 guides. And what they called it is non-directive listening. And so the sense is that you're not trying to in any way impinge or shift or impose. Listening is an intaking process. It's a process of being present and allowing receptivity to take place. So he says, these are the basic guides. First, take time to listen. And I think we could take that in a very general sense. 2, be attentive, and that comes up over and over, and this focus on listening. And we saw that in Freud, and again, particularly in Jung. Employ 3 kinds of verbal reactions only. Now, this one is funny. I mean, this is really comic. Only vocals, I see, and remain silent and restate. So that restate is like a first a step in establishing, if you're in a strange kind of situation you want to establish. But those are kind of limited verbal reactions, and I'll provide a fuller kind of view of that later. So never probe for additional facts. So again, it's that don't impinge upon the speaker or the group that you're listening to. Let them set the agenda. And 5, never evaluate what has been said. Keep judgment out of it. So this is a non-judgmental, and that again is a premise that comes over and over again in the study of listening. And 6, never lose faith in the ability of the talker to solve his own problems. And that one is very therapeutic. I think too often we want to jump in and save a soul or something. Jung would say a soul, I guess, right? So let's go on to the next slide there. So this is another approach, some general steps for listening. First, prepare to listening, and that it comes up over and over again. It helps to kind of get your presence, to clear your mind, to put your cell phone aside, drop social media completely. So prepare to listen, and also a basic premise that runs through listening studies is learning, is that if we shut up and listen, we learn. And one guru has said that everybody has a story to tell. And so we should be listening for the story to try to get to who this person is that's presenting to us, and not be judgmental about it. So then again, get ready. An attitude, having the right tone, how we say things is very important. Being open and neutral comes up again and again to get judgment out of the way. Dispel strong feelings. Strong feelings distort. Feelings are fine, but strong feelings are not an effective use of emotion. But of course, also you can try to read the emotion of the speaker and get a sense of who they are and what they're about. And for me, it's looking at somebody, their whole composure, what my sense of them is. And some of the politicians, some of you will know, running around today, when I look at them, the shiver runs down my body when I look into their eyes, even on the media. So there's something to read there in the whole presence of the individual. Be open and ready to listen to new ideas. I think that again is very important about listening to learn, is that everybody has a story and everybody has an education, and those educations can be profound. I'm thinking immediately, again, funny situation of J.D. Vance, who just won the Republican primary, and how he's a good storyteller, and also was an ever-Trumper, and now I'm listening to hear what he has to say. I'm open, I'm ready to listen. So finally, and this is part of what I just said about Vance, is be curious and be ready to be surprised. That's so very important in listening. So here's another one called a listening playbook. Assuming listening is a play, it's a lot of fun. It can be, really. This is a general strategy for listening. Acknowledgement. First, affirm the other person's, their whole stance, their whole presence, and then build on that. And I think that's very important in our politicized world today, is you don't get very far with somebody if you don't affirm them. And even if you go a little ways, toward reaching out to them and confirming and affirming them, that kind of sets a baseline for then building on that and working with it. And I found it works well in political situations or others that are charged. So pay attention. It costs something, but it's worth it. There's a lot to be gained, as we'll see in a minute. Quiet your thoughts. And that's a Buddhist thing. We talked about Buddhism last week. And what could be more important than quieting your thoughts? Be present, be open to opportunity. There's always opportunity in listening to somebody. And again, might go back to listening to learn. Don't jump to conclusions, stick to the facts. And this is so much of what I call the deficient mythic coming back into modern society as a reaction to the command and control of the irrational consciousness. Now the mythic is coming back with a vengeance. And people want stories. They want stories that somehow affirm what they are afraid of or worried about. And I just read an article in the New York Times Magazine by Cusk, and she says she's worried about narrative and the delusions of narrative in literature. And I think it's not just in literature, it's in the society in general. So we have to see through the story to see if it, not just factual, I guess that we could say there's much more that's important there than just facts. And I taught argumentation and debate for many years, and facts too need to be backed up and supported. But if we're not listening, we don't know how to respond. And I'll come back to that too. So finally, explore other perspectives, expand yourself. And I capitalize that because it goes back to Jung again, the self, expanding the self-awareness. And that is that we do become more individuated if we expand ourselves, if we're open, we listen, we're receptive. That's very important. So here's one more. Outcomes. This is a different perspective. It's like, what do we get out of good listening? And if we haven't had enough of that already, we get a little more. So by listening, we achieve the following. We build and maintain relationships. And for me, that's the foundation of all listening. If we can't do anything else, we should step back and work on the relationship aspect. If we have that, then we can advance and we can do more. Careful listening says you and your needs are important to me. I respect you. Learning, we can find out about friends, family members, clients, and coworkers. There's so much to be learned by receptivity, by being open. And finally, understanding, we realize what it is to experience from another's point of view. And that helps us to expand perspective, which to me in consciousness studies is so important. And again, I go back to Nietzsche, and Nietzsche talked very much about perspectives, about seeing all the different perspectives, but then one step further, and that is, how do we know these are different perspectives? We're already in another place, a more expansive place, so that we can identify and see those different perspectives. So there's so much to be gained here by understanding, by listening in general. One more. This is kind of a step back to a deeper level of listening, and that is questioning, an adjunct to effectiveness. And I'll just go quickly through this because there's an intensity that builds as we ask different kinds of questions. The first are non-invasive. They're kind of open-ended and they don't impose, right? Or prejudice the situation. So clarifying questions to mirror, and we know that in therapy, right? The first step is just to mirror what the client is saying, to give them back. A second step is to clarify what has been said and seek more information. So you said this, is that what you meant? Are you implying, and and have to be careful there because again, we could be steering the conversation, but basically it's mirroring at this level. Second is paraphrasing questions to check for accuracy of facts and feelings. And paraphrase is taking what the person has said and giving it back, or maybe twisting it a little this way, that way, to see if we understood exactly what they were saying and if we understood what they were saying. So 3 is summarizing questions. And this is very critical, where we say, okay, if I understood you, you're saying this and this and this. I'm not drawing conclusions yet. I'm just checking that I've summarized accurately and that I understood what the person has said, what it all adds up to. So seeking to establish the accuracy of our interpretation of the speaker's message. And then exploratory questions. And now these get more intensive and heavier, we might say, more intense. They encourage the speaker to explore the possibilities inherent in a situation. So we might say, okay, it seems like you value what your mother is saying. Is that true? Can I read that in? Right? So very carefully, we try to explore the field of what we think the speaker is saying. And you'll see that this is very much a one-on-one, a dyad kind of thing, but each of these we can expand to a group. And in fact, these questioning levels I got from when I was teaching group communication class, and they were modified in a group process. So I took them from the group process and applied them, interpreted them, shifted them so they would work for listening, because I think it's very important. And 5, supportive questions seek to support the speaker while exploring the values, right? Very critical. Exploring values or criteria upon which they have made a decision. That's a big imposition, right? That's a heavy imposition on somebody. But if you've developed a relationship, if you've taken the steps to get to this level, then that naturally follows, right? We can be very effective. And there was one research study I found and read recently that was about how interesting and fun listening was when we went deep with somebody, right? People really enjoyed it. They didn't think they would, but when they took listening seriously and they got into deep subjects with somebody, a stranger, right? A stranger, they found it was really enjoyable. So here we find, this is my latest work, and I developed this for the Global Listening Center. They wanted me to redo 10 tips for listening. And I stumbled on that one for a while, and I thought, I got to write something really important here. You know, I'm summarizing decades and decades of work in the field of listening. So I broke it into 2 parts. And the first is like ethical principles of listening. Their principles are kind of general. They're not hard edged, but they're work most of the time and in a general kind of way. So the first one is value every human is awesome. Care, listen with and not to. So it's always a field, right? A field of presence that we're in with the other person. Second, listen for relationship before all else. And I've said that before. This ensures more listening. Third, listen with an open mind, be receptive, and always be curious. That always works very well when you say to somebody, oh, wow, that was great. Glad you said that. Consciously choose to listen more and listen better. Be aware of your own listening process. Now we begin to get into Jungian ideas and thoughts. By listening, we become more aware of our own listening process. And that's so important again. The next one, know that listening is an opportunity to learn. We've learned that before. Allow others to teach us. Be aware of culture, age, and gender differences. So as we're listening and learning, notice the identity, but don't focus on it. Identity is not really, I wrote another article about listening to the person, the persona, and not to the identity. So we're making a differentiation there. And finally, listening first with patience to understand and not to, and something's on my screen, not to respond. So next one. So now we get to some tips for listening. Prepare to listen. We've seen that before. And I wrote the other article that came with the title of this article, this talk, was about listening nudges. And I'm not going to go into that there, but it's about making situations safe and constructive, including right down to the architecture or the layout of the room or where we sit, things like that. Make it your focus. Start without managing the conversation and allow the situation to dictate the direction. And that's where I'll go with conscious listening, with riding the horse backwards. Let the speaker finish a complete thought before you respond. Although I know in these days with social media, sometimes it's very hard. We find people talking over each other and we have to back off and kind of reassess, see where we're at. Listen globally for verbal and nonverbal clues. Attend to the situational mood. Mood is often a very important part of listening. What does it feel like? And we'll talk about building up your intuitive ability to sense more of that. That'll be the ending here. Respond and reflect back in a way that shows that you have listened. Very important to let the person know, even if it's like a nod or right? Yeah, got it. If you find you were talking over each other, again, this came from social media, stop talking and review the situation. And finally, listen for emotions as well as meaning. Emotions, again, can tell us a lot. Okay, so the dialogical listening, this is where I end up, and in the culmination of my 40 years or so of listening work in many aspects. 3 styles or moves, and it's hard to describe this. And I thought about a triangle, right, with the three styles or moves at different parts of the triangle, but it's so much more complex than that. That would simplify it way too much and imply that there was an equality or something. And this is very situational, we'll say. So the modes or styles of listening, and I'm going to get this slide. We're going to show a couple of pictures, and then we're going to come back to it. So Lisa, you'll have to go back in a minute. So the first one, 3 postures or styles we have is strategic. I call it strategic, although some people don't like that. They think that's too rational. But I think I like reason better. And Gebser has one quote where he says, the difference between reason and rationality is that reason has a heart. So what we're looking at here is at times we have to be strategic. We have to analyze and see what the situation requires, what it demands even. So I call this also command and control, although there's some fun there. Right, a little bit of humor, but listen with intent, not power, which is destructive. And then the second one is meditative. And this one I call meditative because it's that taking ourselves out of the situation to observe and finally to see what's happening in a situation. And the third one, the third style or movement that we like movements in a musical composition, but it's creative, intuitive flow. And many of you, all of you probably will really appreciate that. Where we listen in the fullness of the moment in presence to hear what the other has to say about lives and so forth and so forth. So the 3 ways of being present all work together, and we'll come back to that. So next slide, the first picture. This is what can come out of dialogic listening. And I mean dialogic, I have to go do a little sidestep here. Here, when we're really listening in a spiritual sense with another person, it's like gliding like an eagle in the air. Riding the currents, right? And my friend and I, we have a Zoom meeting every week, several of us that are concerned about listening. And we talked about that experience where you really connect with somebody and it's just like things are soaring. You just feel in that open sky, place that is so light and airy. So let me go back one more time. Let me go back quickly to the the soaring eagle. And no, go ahead. I'll come back to it 1 second. I have something I have to say about dialogic listening, but we'll get to it. So this is listening in modern times. This is what we have to deal with. It's like we're listening in the midst of a rapids, and we're steering and we're managing the rudder and trying to keep afloat, right? The modern times, there's such a rapids. And it reminds me of Mama Day, an American Indian writer, who talked about time. And he said, we're riding down the rapids in a canoe, and time is the sides of the banks of the river that are passing us, right? So we're in time. Time is passing by. And it's like this when you're listening. It's like time is passing by and you're trying to get your bearings, right? Okay, third one. And this one we saw before. I've worked with Arnie Mindel's work since the early 90s. And I've been in many workshops of his, and I started in Boulder in 1970 with Gestalt therapy, working in Gestalt groups. Not me conducting them, but taking part in Gestalt groups. So I find that this is very important, and we'll come back to this in just a second. So let's go back to the three styles or aspects of dialogic listening. And what I was going to say before, let me come back in with something I forgot, and that is dialogic listening comes out of the work of Algis McCunas, who helped translate Gebser's work, The Ever-Present Origin. And dialogic listening implies that the listening is a creative, intuitive process, and that is founded in the situation, is that nothing more is required but what is in the situation. It's self-founding. So each time we go into the listening process, this is it. This is what we're working on. This is where we are. And so while we're at it, we think maybe strategic is planning ahead to make sure that we have a good situation, a mood, a good place. We're sat in the right place compared to each other and so forth. Maybe we need to sit side by side. Maybe we confront each other. All those things are important. And command and control is kind of a joke. I mean, that would be the modern rational consciousness, the modern world where we want to be in command and control. And I think that's where the deficient revenge comes from, is that people are sick of command and control. Some people are. Others understand what it's about. But all of us know that the modern world isn't perfect. So we have to listen with intent, and not with an attempt to exert power, but the strategy is to see, okay, I missed something here. I was too judgmental. Now I've got to step back, right? So there's that style. The second is the meditative, in observing, where we see what's going on in the situation. We read the nonverbal of the other, and we especially see what we're doing, and the thoughts that come up in our own head and our own posture, our mood, our sentiment. All of these things are so important that we keep those in mind as we go. And then the third part is what holds it all together. And it's like the modus operandi here, creative intuitive flow, where we listen in the fullness of the moment to hear about each other's lives. And the three work together, but I would say that when you get them functioning, the creative flow, and I put flow in parentheses because it's not about time here, it's about being in the moment, right? And so here's where Arnie Mindel's work comes in. When we're riding the horse backwards, we don't know where we're going. And so we have to trust that what is happening, right, is the creative moment that is supposed to happen. But to do that, we need to be observing, meditative, right? We need to be strategic at times. And then riding the horse backwards comes into play. I know that disturbs a lot of people, but for me, it's so important, because if you have an intentionality in the listening situation, you've already prejudiced it. So you have to be open. And this is something that I forget his name, but Michael, somebody who had written about 10,000 hours to learn a new task, a creative art. I don't think it takes 10,000 hours, but to achieve this, I think you need many hours of attending to what you're doing as a listener. How are you creating? What is the feeling of what you're up to? And how could you shift, right? There's these shifts that are going on within the situation, within the process, within the field, right? And so that, to me, best expresses what's going on, is that we ride the horse backwards, and that we trust in what's happening in the moment, in the immediate situation. So I think there's some questions for Jungians here. If any of you know about the transition from Nietzsche and that era, it's not just Nietzsche's, that whole era. And that's the beginning. Some of Nietzsche's best friends were feminists. There's a real shift in consciousness that begins in that era, and that Jung particularly provides depth to and expansiveness.
So, do you want to open it up to discussion now, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
I'm gonna put on my